All right, hello everyone. Hello React Brussels. It's been many years since I've been in Belgium, so I'm so glad to be back here again. This is basically going to be a crash course where we are going to learn the right way to use effect and saying goodbye to all of the other use effects that we really don't need in our applications. So buckle up, we are in for a ride. Hopefully you will learn a lot of things today. But first of all, I'm extremely happy to be here. Who's happy to be here at React Brussels? Yeah? All right. Who's a little sad that it's ending so soon? I mean, we had a lot of amazing talks, like some of my favorite talks today. How many of you feel like this? Have you seen this smiley before? This is the frustrated React developer smiley. So, yeah. So of course, thank you. Now, I learned hooks. I was actually fortunate enough to get a preview of hooks when they first came out, and they all looked really interesting, except use effect. I'm like, all right, that's going to be an interesting one. And then, people started saying, okay, use effect. I have an effect. This is where it goes. But then the problems kept creeping up, and I'm sure in your code bases, if you're using React, you might have some really nasty use effects in there. But if you're struggling with use effects, don't worry. Even senior React developers struggle with it. If anyone tells you otherwise, they're not making, good enough React applications because you do need use effects in your application. And you might have this big nasty dependency array and if statements. It's all very typical. It's just a really awkward hook, all right? So typically, this is what our use effect looks like. We have a use effect, it does something, we have a cleanup, dependencies, all is fine. It might have worked before, but then guess what? React 18 came out, and it rendered this again. So it ran the effect twice on mount in strict mode. How many of you have actually ran into that, or is that just a me problem? Okay, a bunch of you. So use effect, if I were to summarize this talk in just one slide, it's not for all effects. In fact, I would say it's even confusingly named. It shouldn't be use effect, it should be use synchronized. But we're going to be talking about that in a minute. So what was life like before use effect? Well, we had component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount, and these were all convenient places to put your effects, especially the effects that were long-lived inside of your class-based React components. And so when we moved to hooks, thankfully, we need to figure out, okay, I have these effects in my lifecycle hooks, so where do they go now? Well, we put all of our componented mount effects inside of this one with an empty dependency array. We put the ones where it happened on componented update in a non-empty dependency arrayed use effect. And then this awkward looking component will unmount, it goes in use effects with this return function. And this just looks really, really awkward. So I want to say, first and foremost, that use effect is not a lifecycle hook. And while you could use it that way, and it is expected to run at the exact same time as you mount your component, unmounts, and change, it's not the way that you should be thinking about things. Danny Abramov even said that the mental model of use effect is synchronization, not lifecycle. And so we're going to be talking about why exactly that is. All right, so we have our use effect, we have the effect in there, we're doing something, and the dependency array, it's, this is when that effect is going to be executed. Now, React is supposed to be this declarative framework, but honestly, this might feel like, okay, we're doing our effects in a declarative way, but in reality, there is a ton of indirection over here. So take the imperative approach first. Like when something happens, like an event or something else, a button is pushed, a form is submitted, execute this effect. You might be looking at this and saying, okay, that's the imperative approach. The declarative approach with use effect looks more like this. When something happens and it causes the state to change, then depending on which parts of that state change, which is the dependency array, this effect should be executed. See how it's more declarative, right? But only if some condition is true inside of my use effect. Also, React may execute it again for some future reason. but only in strict mode, which you shouldn't disable for some future reason. So, I mean, honestly, whatever your opinion is on imperative versus declarative, I prefer the imperative approach. And you could express it in this imperative approach in a declarative way. We'll be talking about that later too. But some of you might be thinking, you know what? I didn't really have a problem with use effects. Like, I just do something, I return a cleanup, and I put things in my dependency array. Everything is fine. But the more you add features and changes to your application, your use effects start to look more like this, where we have a bigger dependency array, we have multiple use effects, we forget the cleanup, and we have this nasty conditional in here, and we're doing things depending on what's inside there. So we're trying to control the fire hose of changes happening so that our effect happens at exactly the right time. And I've seen this code all over the place. I've searched SourceGraph for examples, and there's just plenty of examples. This is a particularly nasty one. And so it really showed me that dependencies are really the wrong mental model for effects. We want effects to execute when things happen, not exactly when things change. So let's get back to the original issue. React 18 running effects twice on mount in strict mode. How do we fix this? And first of all, why does this happen? So React is actually doing this on purpose behind the scenes. It's not a bug or anything. It's mounting the components, and then it's doing a simulated unmount of that component, which is calling the cleanup of the effect, and immediately afterwards, it's remounting the effect. So you get your double execution of the effect. And so, when I first ran into this, I was like, this is a bad hook. It's useEffect. It feels like a major, major foot gun. But honestly, this was React's way, at least React 18's way of telling you, hey, you're using the useEffect hook wrong. So what is useEffect for? It's for synchronization. And so there's a difference between fire and forget effects and synchronizing something in your component with some outside source. So take this example. We're synchronizing with some external API, some store API, so that whenever the item changes, we're getting this item data. And we return an unsubscribe function, and this is going to change whenever our item changes because we need to unsubscribe to the old item and resubscribe to the new item. Now, doing something like this means because you're just keeping track of some external thing, we could unsubscribe and resubscribe multiple times. It doesn't matter. It's like watching TV. If you put on the news, you could turn the TV on and off. You could change channels. You could go back to the previous channel. That news channel is still going to be the same. So that's sort of the mental model that you should be thinking of with useEffect. The React documentation distinguishes between effects and event handlers. So when React is talking about effects with a capital E, they're talking about long-lived effects. So these subscriptions that I'm talking about. When we're talking about fire and forget effects, React in the docs mentions that as event handlers. So here's the difference. A fire and forget effect, you don't care what the results are. This could be a console log, an analytics call. Maybe you're sending some data asynchronously, but you're not awaiting a response. A synchronized effect is when you're actually communicating with an external system. So this effect could actually be long-lived. And so that's why it's fine for it to unmount and remount, because just like changing channels on the TV, you are just changing, you're changing the subscription, but you still get the same values. Okay, so where exactly do the action effects, those fire and forget effects, where exactly do those go? We know that we shouldn't really be putting side effects in render, even though in some instances it's actually okay, but let's just assume that you can't do that. And we already know by now, hopefully, that putting it in useEffect is awkward. So where else do we have space in this function to put it? And don't say the gap between that because I just forgot to fill that in. Outside the component, maybe? Let's explore this. So when we mentioned that useEffect is going to run twice when you mount a component, here's what's happening. We're attaching that effect to the components mounting and unmounting. So when an event handler causes a state change, that is going to cause the component to re-render. But also remember that React can remount that component. And so this effect might be executing multiple times. So if we put it outside of the render, say over here, it doesn't matter how many times that component unmounts and remounts and how often React re-executes that useEffect. The effects that we put outside of the component rendering and outside of useEffect is only going to be executed once. So these action effects should actually happen outside of rendering. So then where exactly do action effects go? Inside of event handlers, at least sort of. So we have this submit data inside of this form on submit event handler, and this is actually going to be a much better pattern than trying to do this in a useEffect. And we're going to see an example of this shortly. So by doing it this way, you have this pattern of when an event happens, an effect is executed. And so if you do it using useEffect, then this is the mental model. When an effect happens, you're changing some states, which can trigger an effect because that effect is listening for a state change. And especially if you have multiple useEffects, other states may change, and you get a chain of triggered state changes, which might trigger another effect. And this becomes really, really hard to visualize, really hard to think about. All right, so everything I'm going to explain, including when to execute action effects and when to use useEffect, this is all actually explained in the new React docs at beta.reactjs.org. When I first started giving a talk like this, these actually did not exist. So I'm actually really thankful. If you go to the normal reactjs.org documentation site, they have a nice banner on top that points you to beta.reactjs.org. I really encourage you to visit it because there's a lot of great information in there. And one of my favorite sections is you might not need an effect. So I'm going to explain to you all of the different points that they make. First one is you don't need a useEffect for transforming data. I mentioned use memo here. You don't even have to use memo. So let's take this example. We have a cart. We're keeping track of the items. We're keeping track of the total. And so whenever the items change, we have to update the total, right? Your first thought might be, OK, that's an effect. When items change, set the total to the new number of items. But guess what? You could do this directly inside of the function. So a derived value is just you're reducing the items, or if you don't want to use reduce, you could have a function that just calculates the total price, but you could do it directly inside of the components. And if this is an expensive operation, and only if it's an expensive operation, you could take this and you could put it inside of a use memo, if you really want to. Don't overload your components with use memo because you're basically trading performance for memory. And yeah, only use this when you really need to, when you have expensive calculations. But yeah, you don't need useEffects to calculate derived state. And I actually ran into this problem. Like, basically, whenever you see a set state inside of a useEffect, it should be sort of a warning sign to you, especially if this happens. I've had this happen before. I've had it happen with a fetch, which is really terrible because that makes a million API calls, so much that React has actually had to add a warning saying like, hey, this is rendering 1,000 times and you're probably doing something wrong. And so that's why some people think that the default behavior of useEffect is an infinite loop. But this is now mentioned in the beta docs that this is actually a pitfall, and you should not be setting state, or at least you should avoid setting state inside of useEffect. And also, don't forget that dependency array. It's extremely important. All right, second thing, you don't need useEffects for communicating with parents. So sometimes we have this pattern where we have on open and on close in the parents. And so depending on the state of something, we are calling on open or on close. So the problem with this is that you might be accidentally introducing additional renders because the useEffect, because of a state change, it's re-rendering, and then it is in the next cycle, like when useEffect is called, it is telling the parent to do something, which might tell the component to do something. So you might be introducing additional re-renders inside of there. So a better pattern to do is move these effects, like on open, on close, so these fire and forget effects, move them closer to where the state change actually happens. So I'm calculating if it's going to be open or if it's going to be closed. I'm keeping track of state, which I might not actually need to do here. And then, depending on whether it's open or closed, I call directly in the event handler, this toggle view event handler, on open or on close. And you could have also, when you do that, you could easily refactor it to a separate hook, and then you have this nice use toggle hook that you could just use directly in your component. It's a much, much simpler way to express that logic and to contain it in a hook. All right, so third thing, you don't need useEffect for subscribing to external stores. So I know what you're thinking, like I just said that this is the one thing that you should use useEffect for, and it is true most of the time. However, there is a really cool hook that was mentioned in the last talk, use sync external store. And you might think, okay, that's a very complicated sounding hook, and it seems like it's for advanced use cases, for library authors, but it actually makes things a lot simpler. So going back to a previous example where we're subscribing to a store API, I'm checking for the connection status, and I'm setting is connected, which again, if you're setting state over here, it might be a warning sign that you might be able to refactor out this useEffect. And so I'm subscribing to it, then I'm calling unsubscribe, and I'm reading data from this store API. So instead of doing this, I could use the use sync external store hook, and it actually makes things a lot simpler because we're getting is connected from this snapshot over here, the store API.getStatus, and we're reading whether it's connected or not. So this is going to be a Boolean. We pass in the subscription function, or the function that will actually subscribe to the store. And we also provide a server snapshot, so this could run on server-side rendering. All right, this one is actually a big one, because this accounts to like so many of my previous uses of useEffect, which is fetching data. We think, okay, I need to fetch data, I need to call an API, so I'm just going to stick it in an effect. But the better way to do this is actually render as you fetch. So here's an example. You all have probably seen this 100 times where we have to do this weird dance of having a cancellation flag, and then we get our items, and if it's canceled, so if we navigate away or we don't want to call this promise anymore, we're going to ignore the response from that promise, and then we set the items, which again, if you see this in the useEffect, it's a warning sign. And then we return this cleanup where if anything changes, is canceled is true. Also, I forgot the dependency array. I legitimately forgot it. I just realized that now. So this is a very, very bad useEffect. All right, so what are some alternatives? Well, like was mentioned in previous talks, Remix has a great API. So long story short, frameworks. Use whatever the frameworks provide you. And if you don't have that, then use query works well too. But with Remix, you could define a loader function, and you just get your items, and that's going to be available to your component immediately. You don't have to do that useEffect dance. Next.js has something similar with get server-side props, so you could just await get items in that function and return it as props over here into your actual component. And so React Query, I'm sure a lot of you are using React Query. It's an excellent library. It's not a state management library. It's not even a fetching library. It's a caching library that works really well with fetching data. So in this case, I'm actually doing prefetch. So I'm prefetching this data, I'm populating it in, and then I'm reading it. So instead of useEffect and summary, you should either use query, or use a hook like that, or use a framework, or use another hook that was actually recently, it's not out yet, it was recently announced, it's use. Just use. So I'm serious. You might be thinking, like, what kind of hook name is this? I mean, it's a legitimate hook name, but it is actually an RFC, first-class support for promises and async await. And so this is actually probably maybe going to be the future of using suspense inside of React. So basically, you would fetch a post, and you would have some sort of caching mechanism, which React is still trying to figure out. But again, this is how useQuery works under the hood as well. And so this is going to automatically suspend your component. So it seems really cool, terribly named, but that's the future. All right, and so Dan Abramov actually said there's a lot of problems with fetching in useEffect. You might have race conditions, no instant back button. So basically, when you go back to a page, you have to load that data again. No initial HTML content. When you render your page, you're going to see a lot of nasty loading spinners, and also chasing waterfalls. So if you're fetching inside of your parent component, you have to wait for that. And then when your child component renders after that's done fetching, you have to wait for that. It gets really annoying. There's also the fact that you don't need to use effect for initializing global singletons. So for example, we know that this is now going to run twice. So instead of it running twice, we could use a ref to track whether it was called or not, but that gets really annoying. And so we could just move that ref outside of the component, especially if you're running this effect inside of the root components, but you're still using a use effect. So instead, honestly, just call it outside of the component. There's really no harm in it. Now, you might be saying, what about server-side rendering? What about testing? Just move it into a function. The point of it is that you don't need to put everything inside of a component. And so finally, the one that I really want to get into, you don't need to use useEffect for handling user events. So like we talked about before, this is submitting logic when we submit a form. It looks very similar to the promise example, except now we have extra variables for whether it's loading, whether it's canceled. We also have to keep track of errors. Instead of this, you could just put it inside of a side effect inside of the event handler. So this is on submit right over here. And this, it also gets pretty nasty. So that's why I would say that when you are working on logic like this, you should extract it out to a hook. And so my favorite hooks are of this form where we get the state and we could also send an event. Some of you might know me because I created xstate. This is how xstate works. This is how Redux works. This is how useReducer works. And it is a very, very useful API because all of our actions and events that happen are reduced to a single line where you're just sending an event object. So it makes things very clear and very easy and succinct. And so I'll actually give you a really quick demo of this, including like just a useEffect demo. So this is an example application, and here's how it works. When I click the video, it opens and plays. When I click outside of it, it closes. And when the video is finished, right now it immediately closes. So right now, actually in the back, can you all see these useEffects over here? Can you read them? I can't read them either because there's too many of them, and they're really, really complicated. So I have a bunch of useEffects here. This one is controlling whether the video is playing or paused. This one is controlling whether the video has ended. And we have that nasty if statement in there. And this one is controlling whether we have pressed the escape key, because I could press the escape key and close it. Now, I also want the user behavior of when the video ends, I want it to wait 2 seconds before closing. And so that's probably going to be another useEffect. We need to add code to all of the other 3 useEffects just to make sure that we're handling those correctly and we're not closing it prematurely. So instead, I want to show you by ways of diagramming how I would model this instead. So here. Right now, we have the behavior where we start in the mini state where our video player is nice and small, and on some toggle, we transition to a full state. So, we just toggle back and forth. We could toggle like this. Now, in the full state, this is what I mean by declarative effects. So in full, when this is open, I actually want to play the video. So I'm just going to add this as an action, like that. Let me zoom in. And when I exit the full, so when I go from full to mini, I want to pause the video. because the video might not be done, so I just want to make sure it's being paused. So this, it's sort of like a flowchart. You could envision how it works, like we're mini, and then when we click, we're in the full mode where we see the video playing, and when we toggle, we're back to mini. Now, there's a couple of other things that we could do. So I'm going to add an invocation. And so basically, we're going to add some listeners. This is going to listen for whether the video ended or not. And I also want to listen for, or actually before that, I want to do this. So we are going to also add events for video ended. And we are going to add an event for key.escape. All right. So this is our logic so far. So when we're in full mode, whether the video ends or you press the escape key or you click outside the video, it should go back to mini and it should pause the video. So, that makes sense so far. So I actually also want the additional behavior of when I'm in the full state, like let's just say that this is playing. I also want to wait for 2 seconds. So how can we do this in like this diagram? So I could just have a state for when it stopped, and I could move this video.ended. I'm going to move this over here, drag it a little. And so when the video stops, here's the logic, and this is logic that you might be sharing with a designer or a project manager, that when the video stops, I want to wait for 2 seconds. So, oops, let me reload that real quick. All right, so I want to wait. Weird. I want to wait for 2 seconds. So here's how we could do that. Pretend you didn't see that. All right, so after, I'm going to do 2 seconds, I'm going to transition to mini. So if you're trying to explain this logic to someone, you could simulate it here and say, we're going to toggle to full, and then when you press either toggle or key escape, it goes back to mini. But when the video ends, then after 2 seconds, we want it to close and go back to the mini state where the video is paused and it's, where we're no longer seeing the full video. So a couple of other things I have to add. In order to listen to these events, key escape and video ended, I need to add some invocations. So video ended and also key escape. So basically, we're listening for these two things to happen. And this is our complete logic for how I want this to work. Now, I only have 1 minute and 44 seconds, so let's see how quickly I could live code this thing. In fact, actually, I probably don't have time to do that, so I am just going to copy the code over here. And right now, this is not working. No magic tricks, okay? Not working. So I'm going to go here, paste this machine in. This is an X-state machine. And, I forgot something. Actually, it literally says, David, don't forget this. So, oops. All right. Don't clap yet. All right. So, so when I click the player, I have to send the toggle event, and that's all I have to do. So hopefully this works. If I click here, if I click outside, if I click here, if I press escape, and if I click here and I wait for the video to end, give it 2 seconds, 1, 2, close. There we go. All right, so this is now available at stately.ai/studio, and we actually released our v1.0 today, so please check this out if you want to. But yeah, I'm really excited that we have this out. So in short, just to summarize, because I have 20 seconds, when do effects happen? In these state transitions where an event is occurring, and then you model that as an effect. So where do these action effects go? Inside of these state transitions, which most of the time happen to be executed at the same time as those event handlers. So in short, useEffect is not for all effects, it's for synchronization. State transitions are what trigger effects. Action effects go in event handlers. You should render as you fetch. And also, it might be nice to model effects with state machines. So thank you very much, React Brussels.